Pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual novice. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. Curiosity Club is made barrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon. Let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to alumni Trevor Blake of Synchronofile.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't peek. Thank you to Core 77 and Hand-Eye Supply, and thank you all for coming. Richard Buckminster Fuller was born 120 years ago on July 12, 1895. He was a public speaker and a philosopher of artifacts. When Fuller was a child, it took tons, measurable tons of copper wire to communicate across the ocean electronically. He lived to see a time when a few pounds of copper wire in radio receivers could do the same thing. And he even lived long enough to see where a few ounces of copper wire in a satellite could do the same thing, communicating around the world, ever more people communicating with ever less material, always doing more with less. He coined the phrase the word ephemeralization to describe that. He was also able to ephemeralize himself in that Buckminster, not the most common name, was a little too rich for his blood. So he tried Dick, he tried Richie, he tried other things, but he stuck with Bucky, and that's the name he's known by the most. When he lived in Chicago in the 1930s, his eccentricity was already full in force. He would appear in public wearing his undergarments. He would wear a t-shirt out in public. And he would exercise not in a gymnasium or at a track, but on the city streets. He would not quite walk, but not quite run. He called it dog trotting. And in the 1930s, here's this man in a t-shirt jogging. But there wasn't a name for it. There wasn't a context for it. Far ahead of his time, but we didn't keep the phrase dog trotting. It's jogging now. he often would try things and do things well before there was a name for them. And sometimes his idea lived on, but the name didn't. Sometimes the name lived on, but the idea didn't. And tonight I'm going to try and connect the dots of what did he predict and how did it work out. From childhood on, Fuller kept every scrap of paper that came his way. All his schoolwork, all his letters that he sent, he made copies, all the letters he received, all his laundry tickets, all his parking tickets, every time he appeared in a newspaper. And he arranged it not by topic or location, but by time, the oldest to the newest. And he'd have a new volume bound, sometimes several volumes bound every year. And he called it the Chronofile, a chronological file of his entire life. He said it wasn't that he thought he was all that special, but it was because he wanted a record of what the average man's life was like in the earliest 20th century. It ended up being many tons of papers. Anything that crossed his path, he kept. And it seems eccentric that a person would document themselves so thoroughly, except most of us here have a Facebook page and document ourselves on a global scale. He just did it for himself, but we document ourselves for the whole world all the time. He was just doing it almost a century ago. He bought the global rights to the telegram address Bucky. Eccentric at the time, even in self-aggrandizing, but most of us here have an email address, my name at the such and so thing. Fuller wore 3 watches from being a young man to an old man. One saying the time of where he physically was, one of the time of where he was going as a world traveler, and one for Bear Island, which his family had owned for generations. That was his ancestral home. Now it'd be hard to find a watch that can only show one time. But he had to do it the manual way. In 1922, Fuller made a first attempt at a shelter, a first attempt at a building for storing people, storing things. It was the stockade system. It had metal bars that formed something that looked like a jail or a stockade, and you'd set those in the ground in a foundation, and then you'd slide these bricks over them. You didn't need the mortar between the bricks. They compressed themselves because they were made out of cement and sawdust. This was in 1923 to 1927. 240 of those structures went up. Some of them are still standing. The idea is entirely like the cob houses of the Portland City Repair Project that you see around, the nice organic shapes, sometimes near bus stops. But here was Fuller giving it a go in the 1920s, some 80 years earlier. In 1929, he worked on the Dymaxion House, hexagon-shaped, elevated on a pole. The hexagon shape, he felt, offered more opportunities to interact with the walls and the floor. The suspended from a pole is because materials are stronger in tension than compression. If you can imagine a chain or a wire, you can put a heavy weight on that wire and it'll do just fine. But if you turn it upside down, it's weak. Like a bicycle spoke, you could put a heavy weight on it. In fact, the whole weight of the bicycle is not from the ground to the wheel to the spoke to the hub, but a bicycle hangs from the top spoke as it spins. The whole weight of you and the bike is on that one spoke. But if you did it the other way, it just collapses. So that's why the house on a pole. It was designed to be delivered by aircraft. A Zeppelin would fly over the landscape with a 4D Dymaxion House in tow. It would swing down. They'd drop a bomb in the ground, and it would plant it like a tree. We're still waiting for that method of architecture, but the evening is young. But the most important thing that he wanted to convey was that housing should be an industry. And he explained that by way of an analogy. Imagine we obtained our cars the same way we obtained our houses. First off, we'd hire a contractor to come and give us the specs for the car and pay the regulation fees for that. We would have the local permits for the construction of the car on our property. We'd have the upholsterer come by to do the seats, the electricians come by to do the electricity, the glaziers to do the glass, the metal smithers to work on it on site. And with luck and patience, perhaps in a few years, we would have our automobile, whereas instead you can just go buy a car. Fuller wanted houses to be manufactured on the industrial level. It would take millions of dollars to make one plastic fountain pen, but to make millions of pens cost pennies. They're so cheap you can give them away. And he wanted houses to be so cheap you could give them away. So this was his earliest industrial house, the Dymaxion House, hexagonal, hangs from a pole, 1929. In 2008, New York City held a competition called What If NYC, What to Do in Disaster Relief. And the winning entry had a hexagonal structure suspended from a pole that could be delivered by helicopter. That was in 2008. Nowhere was Fuller's name mentioned, and it could be that the ideas are just so good and so clear that it's someone else rediscovering those same ideas. It's not necessarily the case that this person stole the ideas, but don't they overlap nicely? To get to and from your Dymaxion house, well, you need a Dymaxion car. This was Fuller's automobile that was completed on July 12th, 1933, his 38th birthday. It stood out because of the aerodynamic shapes. You can see the other cars near it like boxes with the carriage and then the engine in front, because when you've got a carriage, the horse goes in front. So you put the horsepower in the front like this. In the Dymaxion car, the engine's in the back to put the weight on the back wheel where the chain was. It was also steering from the rear like a fish, because fish don't have their tails in front. Birds don't have their tails in the front. So why should a car have its turning mechanism in the front? It was 19 feet long, modern cars 15 to 19 feet long, got 30 miles to the gallon, could easily go 120 miles an hour. It had, in the chassis, you can't see it from the outside, but it had holes on the inside to make it lighter in the same way that modern cars do. When it was tested on a Bronx racetrack, the professional driver commented on how smooth it was, but what he didn't know is that they'd broken the speed record at that track by 50%. It was just too smooth to tell. In 1933, it was exhibited at the World's Fair, and some investors from Germany were flying over on a Zeppelin to perhaps invest and start the Dymaxion Car Company. Fuller hired a professional driver to run its courses. There was a driver and a passenger in the car, and they were driving to meet the investors. The next thing that the newspapers reported was the Dymaxion freak car in terrible accident, driver dead, wreckage on the side of the road. It was terrible. Look at this terrible man who made this death trap and killed the professional driver. There was a two-month examination, both by Fuller, by the police, by the insurance companies, by all of them, and the Dymaxion car was found not to be blamed. The passenger who survived was unconscious for those 2 months, but when he came to, he described what happened. They were going at speed down the road, and another car pulled up beside them and honked, said, "You want to race?" So the Dymaxion car was tearing through these country roads, the other car was tearing through the country roads, and it couldn't match them. The Dymaxion car was faster, it could take the corners faster, and the other car, to win, bumped it off the road. The police showed up, and it turned out that the man in the other car was a city commissioner for the city of Chicago. So his car and his self was taken away very quickly before the newspapers got there. But what the German investors heard was, freak car kills driver, and that was the end of that. But he did have time to make 3 Dymaxion cars. This is the second one. You can tell because of the faceting on the front window there. The first one was smooth like a bullet, like a fish. The third one looks most like this, but didn't have this fin in the back, and it had a little tower here because instead of a rear view mirror between the shotgun and the driver, you looked through a hole and there was a periscope looking backwards. It also had a grill in the front. All 3 models had a grill in the front for a big block of dry ice. So as you're going down the road, you can open a little vent and the dry ice would blow in. So one of the earliest air conditioning attempts. The first car was sold. The second car lost in the accident. The third car disappeared for a long time, and it was finally discovered that during the Korean War it was melted for scrap. But during the period between the third car and the 1970s, he never stopped thinking about vehicles, and he never stopped learning from the mistakes of the Dymaxion car. It's great once you've got a rear turning mechanism if you're going straight or backwards or turning at a slow speed, but if you're at a high speed, it tends to fishtail like a fish. And his solution in the 1970s, when he was asked to make another car by the Kaiser Corporation, was the Kaiser car. Shorter, it had independent motors in the front wheels, and the front wheels could turn, not just turn but tilt, so that as it went into a turn, it would accommodate that turn, and the rear wheel was on a boom. If you went faster, it came out further, so your wheelbase was larger. Some kind of strange 3-wheeled car, not unlike the Toyota iRoad from 2 years ago. 3-wheeled car with tilting and turning front wheels powered from the independent motors in the front of the road. Fuller also made these cars during the Great Depression. There were around 30 jobs, and hundreds of men lined up out the door to get any of them. And he decided that he would hire them by who had the largest family, and who hadn't eaten the longest. And that's how he assembled his crew. An idea of sustainable employment that has come around again. Even after the Kaiser car, Fuller suggested the traveling cartridge, a self-propelling vehicle, a vehicle that the front one can bear the brunt of the airstream and the rest can hitch a ride off of it. A smaller car for 1 or 2 people at a time, because why do you need to have 4 or a dozen people in your car when you can just have a train of cars? He also didn't advocate ownership of the cartridge car. He liked the service industry model rather. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to own a telephone, because the phone company, the single phone company, does such a good job leasing it to you for pennies. Why would you ever want to own a personalized telephone? And that times have changed in that regard. But he did make the same claims about automobiles. Why do you need to express your personality with your car? Aren't you the personality in the car? Aren't you in the self-driving car, in the service industry rentable car, the personality? These are car-to-goes and Pioneer Square, downtown Portland, and one of the Google self-driving cars, which everyone in this room will live to see. He even got the size and the general shape correctly. In 1937, Fuller designed the Dymaxion Map. It was a map that could be made flat, but also folded into a faceted, not quite a sphere, but a faceted shape, an icosahedron, dodecahedron. I have a large Dymaxion map in the back. Perhaps you've seen it. And he wanted to make a map, yes, he wanted to make a map where you could see the entire world at once. And he got us a globe and put a lattice of wires over it and rotated the wires over the globe until none of the wires crossed a major land body. That's where he drew his lines to cut out the globe, and he took that, folded it flat, and that's why it has such a curious outline shape. That's the only shape you could find that doesn't cut through a major landmass. He also wanted to make what he called a Geo Scope. This is one of the only Geo Scopes that was ever made at a large scale. He talked about it, he drew some photos. He had plans for geoscopes as big as a city block that would be flat and then fold up on giant pistons and rotate. And it's just barely visible, but on this geodesic sphere is a skin that represents the land masses. And on the skin were little blinking lights. And a person could sit and look at the geoscope as it rotated and see the lights of industry and the lights of natural disasters and the lights of relief agencies going to those natural disasters. He felt if people could see it, if they could see the world at once and they could see the connectedness of it in 1952, that they would stop squabbling over their national borders quite as much. 52 years after the geosphere, Google Earth, a little Earth we can have all in our personal phones, and we can see the disasters in the news and make our own indentations on it. Fuller's first book came out in 1938. It was called 9 Chains to the Moon. And the effect of that is, if you have a person, and you have a person standing on that person, and have another person standing on that person, and you make that chain of people go all the way into space, it would take not one chain to reach the moon, but all of humanity would make 9 chains to the moon. Head on foot, 9 times back and forth to the moon. That was his way of trying to describe how many of us there are and how important it is for us to get along better. In that 1938 book, Fuller wrote, in a section on predictions, the main system of general education instructions to go on the air and on the screen between July 12th, 1938 and July 12th, 1948, both his birthday again, his 43rd and 53rd birthday. So here's Fuller predicting in 38 that education would go on the screen and on the air. In 1962, he wrote Education Automation, which said that the best way to educate young people and old people would be this. You summon the finest lecturers and you record them on cassette tapes. And through the mail, you distribute those cassette tapes to schools all over the planet. And people who have that cassette have the ability to edit that cassette. If there's a new piece of information, they can edit that little piece of sound in, or if something's superseded, they can pull that little piece of sound out. And that was the way that education will work in the future. When you have a global on-screen and by-the-air system that can be edited to add new information, take old information out. In 1944, Fuller was 50 years old. 20 years had passed since the stockade system, 16 years since the Dymaxion House, 10 years since the Dymaxion car. World War II was ending, and men were coming back to the States looking for work. They'd left everything and lost everything to go fight in the war. They'd gone often because of the draft. They didn't have a choice. They were coming back to a war industry. All of America's industry had been turned to war. Airplane factories had been built to build warplanes. And Fuller approached the Beech Aircraft Company with an idea. He said, these men are coming back, they need jobs, but you don't need to make any more airplanes because the war's over. No more warplanes anyway. So using just your existing tools, let's make houses. Let's make houses so these servicemen can afford a house, and let's retool your wartime factory into a peacetime factory and make houses for them and give them the jobs to make their own houses. The Dymaxion House, suspended from a pole, as the Dymaxion, or the Wichita House built near Wichita, suspended from a pole as was the Dymaxion House, aerodynamic as was the Dymaxion car, because the wind doesn't just go across moving objects like a car, the wind moves across all objects, as wind tends to do. These rectangular-based buildings, the wind hits it and hits it hard. Sometimes it goes through, sometimes it blows down. In this, the wind goes around it. The conning mast at the top turns to face the wind, or turns away from the wind, such that it could be used as a air conditioning and a heating system. It can pull air in and push air out through the top, just from the air pressure outside of it. And if there was a hurricane, that differentiation of air is why that Dymaxion House, or the Wichita House, would not explode. So, the Beech Aircraft Company signed on. 3 labor unions signed on. The United States Army Air Corps signed on. They ordered some prototypes, and they lifted wartime restrictions on some rare metals and plastics so that they could continue this process. They had a prototype ready 2 months after the atom bomb fell. It cost $12,000 at a time when the average house it cost $6,500 at a time when the average house cost $12,000, just a little over half of what a house cost. Every piece of it fit in this metal tube. You would have a truck going down the road, it'd drop off your tube, and inside were all the parts and all the tools to make it, like IKEA does. But long before, no part of it is too heavy for one person to lift. You don't need a special crane or scaffolding system. It's also built from the top down. You plant that mast, then you put the conning tower on, and you lift that up. You put the umbrella-like roof on, you lift that up, put the windows in and the floor last. And because you build it from the top down, you don't need any sort of ladders in your tube of parts. The car, or the Wichita House, was Fuller's big break. Fortune magazine had it on the cover and said, not since Henry Ford have we seen not the birth of an object, but the birth of an industry, the housing industry. For the first time, we're going to have a housing industry, and houses will be cheap and available for everybody. But Fuller felt that more prototypes and research needed to be done. Beech was ready to go. The orders were ready to go. Hundreds of orders were already paid at the Beech Aircraft Company. The money was there, the market was there, but he owned all the intellectual property. He put it under his arm and walked away. And that is the Wichita House, the one Wichita House that ever was. After that, he was broke. He was hand to mouth and shamefaced, and he'd ruined all his goodwill that he had. So back to the drawing board. He wanted to work again on making a shelter, an industrially produced shelter, a shelter that's working from suspension, not compression, made of triangles and arcs rather than right angles. In a conventional building, it uses compression. It has these bricks that hold each other in place with gravity pushing down on them. They're compression structures. A tension structure holds itself up. Any particular piece of a dome will hold all the other pieces of a dome, and you can even pull a part out and it'll just dimple in. A dome, which was Fuller's next project, should be easy to assemble, easy to disassemble. It should be something you can put up and take down, not plant roots like his earliest shelters dropped by bombs. And also not like buildings of today. It would take a great deal of work to take this building and move it to somewhere else, even inches away. So if domes are so great, why didn't domes work out? Because this time he didn't screw the pooch. This time he didn't put the patents under his arm and walk away. He was successful with domes, eminently successful with domes, so why don't we see them everywhere we go? This is a north face tent. North face, partially founded by Bruce LaBelle, who began his shelter relief work in 1976, aiding people in Guatemala. He was sent by the Mohawk Nation to do relief work in Guatemala for an earthquake. A year later, 1977, he was a student of Buckminster Fuller and took in all this information about building a structure with arcs, suspended rather than compressed, easy to assemble, easy to take down, no part too heavy for one person to manipulate. And when he was hired as the special engineer of North Face, he came out with this. He came out with every tent you've ever seen and ever will see. And that's where Fuller's success is. Not in the geodesic domes, although they're grand, but in the tents. And you'll look in vain for Fuller's name on those tents, as did he when Epcot's Spaceship Earth was built in Florida. He went to see it. So here's Spaceship Earth, a phrase he coined. It's a geodesic structure, a shape he didn't invent, but he certainly popularized. And he looked for the dedication, he looked for the thanks to, and it wasn't there. And he asked somebody, "No, who are you?" "Well, who's Buckminster Fuller?" And he was starting to get steamed, but then he saw a plane crossing overhead and realized, well, they don't call that a Wright 747. The important thing is that the idea works, not that my name is on it. So he made his peace with Epcot. He made his peace with the tents, as should we all. Fuller said that he was on the first ship at sea that communicated with an airplane in the air by radio. He's the only one that says it, and it may be true, but it's definitely true that he came around at a time when radio was a new and big deal, and he paid good attention to it. These things, instead of these stacks of papers to transmit information, you could just talk into a little machine, and another little machine would say the same thing somewhere else. He thought in terms of electric lights and radio. In the 1970s, on, I think it was CBS, Walter Cronkite was interviewing Buckminster Fuller, and he had been given a list of some of Fuller's claims, and he said, "Mr. Fuller, it says here that you believe in teleportation, that you'll be scanned in one place and then you'll be sent to another place. Like that's how we'll travel to the stars, by teleportation. Is that true?" And the answer was yes. He believed in teleportation. He had this idea that, as he said in a different interview, we can scan. We are and have pattern integrities. Those patterns can be recognized. You might be scannable like the Broadway electric lights, in which each of the elements of it might be a findable point. It might be the case that you could scan an organism and I wouldn't expect the physical body to transport, just the information about it. Not unlike 3D scanning. Physical objects are scanned, reduced to the information, sent electronically to another place, and printed out. The original doesn't cease existing, the new one does. In 1968, Fuller meets with one of his attorneys, Dale D. Klaus, and Fuller wants to discuss another idea he has, the energy systems for computer memory idea. Fuller's idea was that there's a problem with printed circuit boards. They're flat. They're made with an XY coordinate. To make a bigger one, you have to just make a wider one. And his idea was instead make a flat one that's in layers. And instead of an XY coordinate, have a 60-degree relationship between the points on the circuit board. Triangles forming hexagons, and then layers of hexagons forming the circuit, so that instead of the information going forward and then left and then up again, it can travel in 3 dimensions and have much more density of information. This is something he said in 1968. Instead of having a linear arrangement, which is the way they tend to do things, I do it omnidirectionally, in every direction. So this was not the drawing of the energy system, but this is his idea. Layers of hexagons as a computer system. Not unlike graphene, which is being discussed today. Layers of hexagons that overlap, and when they're offset, form icosahedrons, or form geometric shapes such that the information moves in many directions. More information, a smaller space. They're faster. The test graphene computers are faster than anything that's been made so far. They're more accurate, and they should be here any day now. Fuller was ahead of his time. My life overlapped with Fuller, but I didn't pay attention to him until he was gone. When I was a boy in the 1970s, my father went to my brother and I and said, "Sons, I'd like to build you a geodesic dome for the backyard. You'll have a playhouse, structure in your backyard, geodesic dome." Well, in the 1970s, you didn't see geodesic domes except in science fiction shows. The popular stuff was Grizzly Adams, Little House on the Prairie. So we said, no, we don't want a dome. We want a fort. So he made a fort instead. But he did, to try and convince us, made a little geodesic dome. And I always am thankful to my father for making that little dome and putting it away, but leaving it on a shelf where over time my guilt would grow and grow until I realized, yes, I need to build a dome. Later on, I saw a photograph of the Dymaxion car. I like cars. I like that car. Oh, it's that same guy? I need to read some of this Buckminster Fuller. And I began as a casual reader, a casual collector of things. When I moved to Portland, Oregon, I worked as a used and rare bookseller. And when you're around books and you work in a bookstore, you get first pick. Something nice comes in, you give it some time on the shelf, you count to 3 Mississippi, but if nobody else buys it, it's going home with you after you pay the penny. So I had a modest collection of Fuller materials. As things came in, I'd buy them, trade with other people. The internet happens, more things started coming my way. And eventually I realized I knew a thing or two about Fuller, and I could write some essays. I wrote some essays. I wrote the essays and put them on a blog. The blog essays were collected into a printed book and a Kindle book, and they did pretty well. It got me an opportunity to do some lecturing about Fuller and meeting people who knew Fuller, people who worked directly with Fuller. I've met Fuller's daughter. So it's worked out nicely that this casual but long-term commitment has brought me some measure of success as an archivist of Buckminster Fuller. But I'm always in the shadow, forever and eternally, of Joseph Moore of Arizona. Joe Moore was doing what I did, but decades earlier. He worked for the Buckminster Fuller Institute. So again, he had a chance to look at the real deal. He worked directly with Fuller. And he was such an instrumental help to Fuller to the Buckminster Fuller Institute, that they gave him the first Dymaxion Award. This plate is an award for helping to support Fuller and his work. As soon as Usenet came into being, Joe Moore was there, posting about Fuller, posting essays about Fuller's work, index work. Here's the table of contents of all his book, and here's the index of his book, and here's a photo from his book. And never quite pushing out the whole book, because that would be illegal, but here's everything you can draw around that book, and here's everything you can draw around that other lecture. Every lecture, every time he appeared in public, everything Fuller said, Joe Moore was collecting it and indexing it. And he and I met through Usenet, later again through email and the web. Time passed. Whenever I had a new book, I would send it to Joe and tell him thanks for all his pioneering work. And a few years ago, Joe said that it was time for him to pass on with his archive of Fuller materials. And he asked if I wanted it. So I said yes. And my thought was, I'll go to Arizona and get it. But instead, he had it shipped to me at his own expense. He had it professionally packed and shipped to me. And before he did, he had just one thing he wanted to make sure of. He was confident that my scholarship was good, that I would make fair use of it and be respectful to it and respectful to him. But he did have a question. Are you sure that your floor can support this much weight? Because it's 6 tons. It was 6 tons of books and magazines and slides and maps and domes and models and photographs and videotapes and DVDs and artifacts related to Buckminster Fuller. And no, my floor can't support that, and my apartment is too small for that. So I rented a storage unit. And this is a day or two in to having everything loaded into the storage unit. The size of this room, maybe half as wide, 4 feet by 4 feet by 50 feet. Again, over here, it was a lot of stuff. It was more than I knew what to do with at first. And so I spent a few weeks I'd open a box and look at it and think about it and try and put it all together. And I thought, well, what would Fuller do? What did he advocate? He advocated ephemeralization. And so for 2 years, this is how it went. I would open a box, and in the box, if there were books, well, I've got bookshelves, I can put the books out. If it's a magazine, those magazines can go in the magazine box. But a lot of them were 3-ring binders, like this. Joe's collection was expansive, not just Fuller, but all the ripples in the water that Fuller produced. So everything he could find about domes. And this is the 3-ring binder of domes in Oregon. This is every dome in the state of Oregon with a map indexed by either who owns it or the address, when it was built, the manufacturing firm that built it. I would take these 3-ring binders and take the content out and put it in an envelope. So I'd save just that tiny little bit of space to condense this to something that I could actually put in a couple van loads and take it to the building I live in. Another binder I brought, this is Joe's binder of me. So Joe was documenting me as well as I was documenting him. These are emails that I sent him. This is things that I wrote, photographs of me. That's a thing to get in the mail. Here's your dossier. So it took 2 years to condense it down to such that I could move it out of the storage unit and into my building. And I predict to truly go through it and do it justice is going to be the next 20 years. What I'm doing with it now is I'm going through it now page by page. And I very much mean item by item and page by page. I've got my database of what I have open. I've got Joe's list of what he had open. And I find where it goes in my filing system, because I confess I use my filing system and not Joe's. I use Fuller's. I do it all by time. The physical artifacts that are the same, all the books are here, and the magazines are here, and the slides are here. But the papers are going in chronological order in my own 3-ring binders. That's how I'm doing it. And the collection as it exists now is open to whoever would like to look at it. It's in my home, so I'm not just going to leave my key under the doorstep, but drop a line and you can come look at it and you can borrow stuff. It's fine. That's what it's for. It's not for me to hoard. It's definitely not for me to hoard or sell, since Joe gave it to me freely. And I'm self-taught. If I had formal training as an archivist, I'd do well with it. If I had a huge budget, I'd do well with that. But I do have dedication and a long sense of time. This is a project I've been working on for a long time, not just the 2 years of having the major body of it, but since little tendrils of it since childhood. Ever since I moved here and started amassing stuff as being a bookseller. So as I wind up, I want to talk about what it's like to have any archive, not just this archive, but any archive. If you have an interest, it's too late to start an archive because you already have started it because of your interest. Your mental notes matter for your archive. You can start anywhere. You can start with what you have or the next thing that you get. The only decision you'll have to make very soon and hold to with an iron fist is what you will not collect. If there's a musician you like, are you going to collect that musician, or are you going to collect other musicians who do the same songs as that musician, or other songs in that style? You have to draw a parameter, or your place will be overrun too. But start anywhere. Start with what you have. For me, it's printed Fuller works published during his lifetime in English. And even that is tons of material. Organize it in the way that makes sense to you. It doesn't have to be by time, it doesn't have to be by the type of object, but it does have to make sense to you, and you have to, because you need to put your hands on it and say, well, where's that particular thing? If it's organized, you can find it. And if you can find it, that's one person who can find it, and people will talk to you to find it. You can care for it as well as you can. Don't leave it out in the rain, whatever your archive is, unless it needs to be out in the rain. Put it in plastic sleeves or get a 3-hole punch and punch it and put it in a 3-ring binder. Doesn't matter, as long as you care for it in some way to some degree. Write it all down. You think you'll remember. You are so sure you'll remember what it is and where it is and why it's significant. And after a few hundred, a few thousand, and a few 10,000, you don't. But if you've got it written down somewhere, that's fine. It can be any database you like. It can be 3x5 index cards. It can be a spiral notebook, as long as it's written down somewhere. Because, as I have learned, archives move around. Joe's collection and my collection are now one, and someday my collection will go to someone else. And having it written down and organized means that it'll be a blessing and not a curse to the next person. Take classes as they're available. Federate with other people with your same interest. Join organizations. I'm a member of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and I encourage you to give it a look-see. Expect that you will be told at every stage of your success that you are not qualified. And decide how much that means to you. decide what matters and proceed. Thank you. Fuller invented something called the world game. And in the world game, it was an attempt to, instead of a war game, which was fighting over division of resources, the world game was working cooperatively for the distribution of resources. And in my archive, I've got duplicates and sometimes triplicates and sometimes far more duplicates than that. So tonight, I have brought some of my duplicates. These are for you, but you have to decide how you're going to distribute them. Will someone be bold and snatch and grab? Will you look through it carefully and go piece by piece? That's up to you. But it's not going home with me. And last, I have some of the artifacts. If anyone would like to see them, they're certainly welcome to see them one by one, or I can go through them in front of you as show and tell. If any opinion one way or the other? A few show and tells. The first commercial dome was made in Cape Cod, and this is a snifter from that dome. It says, "The Dome, Cape Cod." It was made and not forgotten about, but somewhat abandoned. And by the time someone realized, no, that is the first commercial dome, it should be preserved for Fuller's legacy, it was too late. So the restaurant, The Dome, is gone, but here's a glass from it. The 1967 Expo ashtray featuring the Spaceship Earth U.S. Pavilion. The U.S. Pavilion was a geodesic dome that has a monorail going through it, ideas that Disney took a shine to later on. And it was dedicated on Fuller's birthday, which was also the anniversary of his marriage to his wife. And he called this his Taj Mahal, his gift to her. This ashtray, no, the dome.
With the 67 World's Fair?
67 World's Fair in Montreal. Every interest has t-shirts. There's one of a stack I have. Only integrity is going to count, the Buckminster Fuller Institute. T-shirts, my friends, t-shirts. Here's Fuller shilling for a Honda Civic in an ad out of a National Geographic magazine. Here is an earlier issue of Life magazine in its day, as popular as anything you could shake a stick at. And right here in the middle is our Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion world. Look at that guy. He did wear a mustache for a time, but only for a year or two. Not many photos of him with the stash. And this issue came with a Dymaxion map that you could fold out or cut out and use yourself. And Life, because Life was such a hugely popular magazine, this is easy to find. Far easier to find than you'd think, because it's so nice. Don't fall. In Joe's collection was this news article about Richard Gabriel. Richard Gabriel is an architect who lives in Portland. I don't think he's here tonight, but he was inspired by Fuller and was making these structures out of spheres and triangles, 60-degree angles and arcs. It's from 1979. What happened to him? I don't know. Oregon has had a long background with domes. One of the earlier and most successful dome companies, Oregon Dome. If you want you a dome, they'll hook you up. That's their catalog. The Armory up the street had a performance of our Buckminster Fuller, The History and Mystery of the Universe, that gave away these bookmarks for it. They also had a drink called the Buckyball in the bar for that performance. These are some Buckyballs, a toy, these rare earth magnet spheres, and a guide to how to use them. This is no longer on the market, sadly, but there it is. 1976 July, National Geographic, in which we find a meeting of the minds. Here are some noted thinkers exploring the future, Buckminster Fuller and Isaac Asimov. They cross paths. Today, if I'm not mistaken, is Marshall McLuhan's birthday. And he and Fuller cross paths as well. On his 100th anniversary, in San Diego, there was a public event that had the Dymaxion car, had his friends and family and coworkers. This is a guide to that event, which I sadly did not go to. Here's a lecture of Fuller on compact disc. I'm sure some of you have heard of such an antiquated medium as this, but there it is. And one last one, the Dome book, a beat up old copy of the Dome book, but I've never seen a better copy. Fuller inspired a generation hard and many generations since, but this generation, the 70s generation, they were ready for those domes. They were so ready for the domes that they weren't going to wait for the industrial dome, the air-delivered industrially made domes. They were going to make their own domes. And by gum they did, lots of them in Oregon. And they published books about their domes. And the Dome Book 2, and Shelter are some artifacts from that time that talk about the Red Rockers and the hippie domes and the forest domes. A friend of mine, who sadly could not be here tonight, his father, when he was a carpenter in the 70s, helped make some of these domes. And my friend Scott said, let's go see one of those domes. So we got in his car and started driving. And we drove and drove for hours. And the sun set. And we kept driving. And finally he said, here it is, pulled over, and we go up in somebody's driveway. And my thought was, well, Scott must know these people. But Scott doesn't know those people. He's just bold as brass. We get up to the top of the driveway and get out of the car. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm in for a penny, I'm in for a pounding. Let's go. We get out and go stand next to this dome house, there it is, and look in the windows. And some people come to the window. Hi, what do you want? We're here to look at your dome. And I let Scott take the lead on this one. We're here to look at your dome. And I look over at Scott and realize we're both wearing all black. And this is how stories of Men in Black happen, because I'm going to go see a dome, and here's these people. So I say, what's it sound like in your house? Because sometimes domes echo funny, and it's hard to listen to music. It sounds just fine in my house. I think you need to leave. And so we left. Thank you. It is.
All right, everyone. Just real quick, I wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming. We return August 4th with Carrie Strickland and Bill Naburka from Works Partnership Architecture, and their talk is Homesteading, the Frame, Warehouse Structures as Creative Workspaces. Architects and principals of Works Partnership Architecture, Carrie Strickland and Bill Naburka, are focused on the possibilities of how cellular environments can adapt to a revolving cycle of inhabitants. We're on like an unintentional theme here. The attraction to frame buildings, warehouse structures, being adapted to creative workspace in Portland is a fairly recent phenomenon, but the notions behind the frame is quite historic. Frame buildings allow for ultimate flexibility in use, not just for one singular moment in time. Frames are literally architecture's equivalent of a sheet of graph paper, eponymous and universal, but expectant with future particularities. How structures architecture is informed and might be inspired by framed cellular space will be discussed in an engaging conversation at the Curiosity Club. All right, that's 2 weeks from now. Let's have another round of applause.